In a small town where dreams rust like old cars, Sarah Miller's world is crumbling. Her son Tommy lies pale and struggling for breath, the local clinic's verdict echoing in her ears. There's no cure. Desperate and out of options, she stumbles into Joe Cooper's auto repair shop, clutching Tommy's makeshift respirator. The town knows Joe as the struggling mechanic who can fix anything with an engine, but few remember he grew up watching his engineer father build medical devices. When Tommy's doctor arrives and sees Joe examining the respirator, his laughter fills the garage. You? A cure? But in Joe's weathered hands, years of mechanical intuition are about to challenge modern medicine. Could a man who fixes cars really save a dying child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Miller's hands trembled as she turned the pages of the family photo album, her fingers tracing the edges of memories that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Tommy, her beautiful boy, smiled up at her from photographs taken just 2 years ago. His 7th birthday party, cheeks flushed with health and joy as he blew out the candles. Back then, the biggest worry in their world had been whether the chocolate cake would turn out right. The quiet whir and click of the makeshift respirator pulled her attention back to the present. Tommy lay sleeping in his bedroom. The device she'd cobbled together from spare parts, keeping him breathing through another night. The sound had become both comfort and torment. A mechanical lullaby that meant her son was still fighting, still here, but also a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Mark's absence felt particularly heavy tonight. Her late husband would have known what to do. He'd always been the one who could fix anything, solve any problem. The irony wasn't lost on her that he'd died in a car accident while rushing home. During a storm, trying to get back to them, when Tommy had his first major respiratory crisis. Sarah closed the album and moved to the kitchen table, covered in medical bills and insurance paperwork. The numbers blurred before her eyes, but they told a clear enough story. Their savings were nearly depleted, and the insurance company had made their position clear. Experimental treatments weren't covered, and they'd reached their limit on approved therapies. During the day, she maintained her job as a high school English teacher, grading papers during her lunch break so she could rush home immediately after the final bell. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stayed with Tommy while Sarah worked, but the kind woman's arthritis was getting worse, and Sarah knew they couldn't rely on her help indefinitely. The routine had become a delicate dance of timing medications, monitoring oxygen levels, and praying that the jerry-rigged breathing apparatus would hold together for one more day. She'd learned more about respiratory systems and mechanical engineering in the past year than she'd ever thought possible, watching YouTube tutorials late into the night and haunting medical supply forums for advice. Tommy's original diagnosis had seemed manageable at first, a rare form of progressive respiratory dysfunction that the specialists assured her could be controlled with medication and therapy. But as his condition deteriorated, the optimistic prognoses gave way to increasingly grim conversations about quality of life and preparing for eventualities. She pulled out her most recent treasure, a small notebook filled with careful observations of Tommy's breathing patterns, medication responses, and equipment modifications. The doctors had dismissed her detailed notes as a mother's obsession, but Sarah knew these patterns held importance. She'd noticed how Tommy breathed easier when she adjusted the airflow just so, how certain positions helped during his worst episodes. Standing at Tommy's doorway, Sarah watched his chest rise and fall in the dim light of his Star Wars nightlight, the one Mark had installed when Tommy was just a toddler, afraid of the dark. The boy's room remained a testament to better days. Model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, half-finished Lego projects on his desk, and science fair ribbons pinned to a corkboard. Tommy had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude, always taking things apart to see how they worked. Now those curious hands lay still against the sheets, conserving energy for the simple task of breathing. The local clinic's verdict rang in her ears. There's nothing more we can do. But Sarah Miller had long since learned that nothing was just another word for not trying hard enough. Tomorrow, she would make the rounds again, calling specialists, researching alternative treatments, following any lead that might offer hope. As she finally settled into her own bed, the familiar worry began its nightly crescendo. The respirator's sounds carried through the wall, and Sarah found herself counting the beats, listening for any variation that might signal trouble. But beneath the fear, a deeper resolve took hold. Somewhere out there, someone had to know how to help her son. She just had to find them. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook Regional Hospital cast harsh shadows across Dr. James Harrison's face as he reviewed Tommy's latest test results. His expression, carefully schooled into professional neutrality, revealed nothing to Sarah as she sat rigid in the hard plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his tone carrying that particular gentleness that Sarah had learned to dread. "These numbers aren't showing the improvement we hoped for." He gestured to the medical report spread across his mahogany desk, its clinical terminology and neat columns of data representing her son's declining health in stark black and white. "But the new medication," Sarah started, only to be cut off by Dr. Harrison's raised hand. "We've tried 3 different treatment protocols now. The simple fact is that Tommy's condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The damage to his respiratory system is becoming irreversible." Sarah pulled out her notebook, flipping to her carefully documented observations. "I've noticed patterns in his breathing when I adjust the airflow on his respirator." "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Harrison's voice took on an edge of patronizing patience. "I understand you're doing everything you can at home, but these amateur modifications could be dangerous. You're not a medical professional." "I'm his mother," Sarah countered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I spend every day with him. I see how he responds, and I've spent 25 years treating respiratory conditions." Dr. Harrison interrupted, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm telling you that continuing to experiment with his breathing apparatus could accelerate the damage. We need to focus on making him comfortable." The word comfortable hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt her throat constrict. "You're giving up on him." "I'm being realistic." Dr. Harrison softened his tone, but his eyes remained clinical, detached. "We've exhausted all standard treatment options. The experimental protocols we tried showed no significant improvement. At this point, any further aggressive intervention would only— There has to be something else," Sarah insisted, pulling out a stack of printed research papers. "I've been reading about new treatments in Europe, alternative therapies that—" "Mrs. Miller!" Dr. Harrison's patience was wearing thin. "I know this is difficult to accept, but you're not doing Tommy any favors by denying the reality of his condition. The kindest thing now is to focus on quality of life for whatever time." "He has left." A knock at the door interrupted them. Nancy, one of the older nurses who had been caring for Tommy since his first admission, stepped in with another file. Sarah noticed how she avoided making eye contact. "The latest blood work you requested, Doctor," Nancy said quietly, placing the file on his desk. As she turned to leave, she hesitated, then spoke again. "You know, my sister's friend had some success with that mechanic over on Cedar Street. The one who used to—" "Thank you, Nancy." Dr. Harrison's sharp tone cut through her words. "That will be all." But Sarah had caught it, that small spark of possibility. "What mechanic?" "Mrs. Miller, please don't pursue that line of thinking. Joe Cooper is a car mechanic who likes to tinker with medical equipment. He's not qualified to—" But Nancy said Nancy should not be spreading false hope based on unreliable anecdotes. Dr. Harrison stood, signaling the end of the appointment. "I'm scheduling Tommy for admission next week. We'll make him comfortable, manage his symptoms, and monitor his condition. That's the best course of action now." Sarah remained seated, staring at the medical report that had just condemned her son. The clinical language blurred before her eyes. Terminal progression. Palliative care recommended. Quality of life considerations. "I'll have my office call you with the admission details," Dr. Harrison said, already turning his attention to his computer screen. "The social worker can help you with the necessary arrangements." Sarah stood slowly, gathering her papers and notebook with deliberate care. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Harrison." Her voice was quiet but clear. "But I won't be scheduling that admission." He looked up sharply. "Mrs. Miller, I strongly advise against. My son is not a lost cause." She met his gaze steadily. "And until he stops fighting, I won't stop looking for answers, even if that means talking to a mechanic." As she walked out of the office, she heard Nancy's voice at the nurse's station. "Joe Cooper, on Cedar Street. His father used to design medical equipment before the accident." Sarah clutched Tommy's medical report to her chest, her steps quickening as she headed for the elevator. She had no idea if this mechanic could help, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't ready to give up on her son. Not now, not ever. Joe Cooper wiped his greasy hands on a shop rag and surveyed the organized chaos of his workshop. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where a '67 Mustang waited patiently for its transmission. Rebuild. Tools lined the walls in careful arrangement, not just standard automotive tools, but precision instruments that seemed out of place in a small-town garage. In the corner of his office, behind stacks of repair manuals and parts catalogs, sat an old leather briefcase that hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay his father's workshop journal, its pages filled with detailed sketches of medical devices and careful annotations in Robert Cooper's precise engineer's handwriting. Joe had memorized every page, though he rarely allowed himself to look at it any more. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Joe from his thoughts. "Be right there," he called, tucking the shop rag into his back pocket. Times were lean lately. He couldn't afford to keep customers waiting. Mike Preston, the local hardware store owner, stood at the counter holding a paper bag. "Brought you some of Martha's meatloaf," he said, setting it down. "She worries you're not eating right." Joe managed a small smile. The town's concern for his bachelor existence manifested regularly in casseroles and home-cooked meals. "Tell her thanks. How's the delivery van running? Smooth as silk since you fixed that timing." "Belt." Mike hesitated, then added, "Though that's not why I'm here. Heard you might be losing the shop." Joe's jaw tightened. The bank's latest notice lay hidden under a stack of invoices on his desk. 3 months behind on the mortgage, and his best. Customer had just switched to the new chain garage that opened on the highway. "Just a rough patch," Joe said, his tone discouraging further discussion. "Nothing I can't handle." Mike nodded, understanding the pride that ran deep in the Cooper family. "Well, if you need anything." He let the offer hang in the air. After Mike left, Joe found himself drawn to his father's briefcase. He pulled out the worn journal, its leather soft from years of handling. The pages fell open to a familiar sketch, a respiratory assistance device his father had designed for premature infants. Robert Cooper had been working on it right up until the accident that took both his life and his wife's, leaving Joe alone at 18 with a half-finished engineering degree and a mountain of medical bills. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. Joe had spent countless hours studying it, understanding how each component worked together. His father had always said that machines were just puzzles waiting to be solved, whether they were car engines or medical devices. A stack of unpaid bills caught his eye, bringing him back to reality. He closed the journal carefully. Dreams of following in his father's footsteps had died years ago. These days, keeping the lights on was challenge enough. The afternoon crept by with routine repairs, oil changes, brake jobs, the kind of work that paid the bills but didn't engage the problem-solving part of his mind that craved bigger challenges. As he worked, his thoughts kept drifting to the journal's sketches, to the way his father's eyes would light up when explaining a new design. In the back room, gathering dust under a tarp, sat his own attempt at continuing his father's work, a partially assembled medical device that he'd been tinkering with in his spare time. He told himself it was just a hobby, a way to keep his father's memory alive, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The light was fading when he finally closed up shop. As he locked the front door, his eyes caught the faded sign above. Cooper's Auto Repair. Quality work, fair prices. His father had painted that sign himself 30 years ago. Some days, like today, the weight of legacy felt heavier than others. Inside his small office, Joe pulled out his father's journal one last time. The pages contained more than just technical drawings. They held a vision of helping people through innovation and careful engineering. He ran his fingers over his father's neat handwriting. "Remember, son, every machine tells a story. You just have to learn how to listen." The evening stretched ahead, empty except for the company of engines waiting to be fixed and dreams waiting to be remembered. Joe tucked the journal away and reached for his tools. There was work to be done, even if it wasn't the work he'd once imagined for himself. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the repair shop when Sarah's minivan pulled into Cooper's Auto Repair, tires crunching on loose gravel. In the back seat, Tommy's breathing had become more labored, the makeshift respirator making concerning sounds she'd never heard before. The hospital's discharge papers lay crumpled on the passenger seat, their final rejection still fresh in her mind. "Just hold on, baby," she whispered, gathering Tommy in her arms. The respirator's portable battery pack was warm against her side as she carried him toward the garage's open bay doors. Joe Cooper looked up from under the hood of an old Mustang, his expression shifting from professional inquiry to concern as he took in the scene. A desperate mother carrying a pale child attached to medical equipment. "Please," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Nancy from the hospital said you might be able to help. The respirator, it's not working right." Joe wiped his hands slowly on a shop rag, his eyes fixed on the breathing apparatus. It was a cobbled-together piece of equipment, but he recognized the underlying design principles, similar to sketches in his father's journal. "Mom, I'm just a mechanic," he started, but his hands were already reaching for the device. Engineers. Instincts taking over as he noted the irregular sound of its operation. "I know what you are," Sarah said firmly, "and I know what your father did. Nancy told me everything. Please, just look at it. That's all I'm asking." The mention of his father made Joe's hands still for a moment. He glanced at Tommy's pale face, seeing the effort each breath required. Something in the boy's determined struggle touched a memory. His father working late into the night saying, "Sometimes, Joe, the simplest solutions come from just listening to the machine." "Bring him into my office," Joe said quietly. "It's warmer there." He cleared papers from a worn leather couch, creating space for Sarah to lay Tommy down. The boy's eyes were alert, despite his labored breathing, taking in the surroundings with curiosity. "You like cars, buddy?" Joe asked, grabbing his precision tools and setting them on his desk. Tommy nodded slightly, his eyes moving to the model cars lining a shelf. "That's my '32 Ford up there," Joe said, carefully examining the respirator's connections. "Built it with my dad when I was about your age." As he worked, his skilled hands identified the problems. A misaligned valve, irregular pressure distribution, inefficient airflow patterns. The solutions began forming in his mind, drawn from years of understanding how things work together. The door chime interrupted his concentration. Dr. Harrison stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. "Mrs. Miller, this is completely irresponsible," he said, striding into the office. "I got a call from Nancy about where you'd gone. You can't seriously be considering letting a mechanic experiment with your son's life support." Joe continued his examination, his movements deliberate and focused. "The primary valve is misaligned by about 3 degrees, he said quietly, more to himself than the others. "It's creating back pressure in the system." "Mr. Cooper," Dr. Harrison's voice dripped with condescension. "This isn't a carburetor you're tinkering with. This is a complex medical device that's operating at 60% efficiency due to mechanical failures that could be corrected," Joe finished, looking up for the first time. "The pressure gauge is inaccurate by at least 15 psi, and the airflow regulator is showing signs of stress fatigue." The doctor's laughter filled the small office. "And I suppose you learned all that from fixing transmissions?" "No," Joe said, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out his father's journal. "I learned it from this, and from growing up watching. My father designed medical equipment that saved lives, while people like you laughed at his unconventional approaches." Tommy's breathing hitched, drawing everyone's attention. Sarah moved to his side, but Joe was already adjusting something on the respirator. The harsh sound smoothed out, and Tommy's next breath came easier. "What did you do?" Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice. "Temporary correction to the valve alignment," Joe explained, his hands moving to make another adjustment. "But it needs more than that. The whole system needs to be redesigned for proper pressure distribution." "This is absurd," Dr. Harrison sputtered. "Mrs. Miller, I must insist." "Look at him," Sarah interrupted, pointing to Tommy. "His color is better already. He's breathing easier than he has in weeks." The doctor fell silent, his medical training warring with what he was seeing. Tommy had indeed relaxed slightly, his breathing less labored. "I can help him," Joe said, quietly, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "But it'll take time to do it right, to build something that will actually give him a chance." "Time is exactly what he doesn't have," Dr. Harrison interjected. "Mrs. Miller, as your son's physician, I strongly advise—" "You're not his physician anymore," Sarah said firmly. "You gave up that right when you gave up on him." She turned to Joe. "How long?" Joe looked at the respirator, then at his father's journal. 2 weeks to build something proper. Maybe less if I can salvage parts from my father's old equipment." "He doesn't have 2 weeks," Dr. Harrison exploded. "This is malpractice." It's hope," Sarah cut him off. "Real hope, for the first time since this started." She placed her hand on Joe's arm. "Do whatever you need to do. We trust you." The weight of that trust settled over Joe as he looked at Tommy, seeing in the boy's eyes the same determination he'd once seen in his father's. He picked up his tools again, already mentally cataloguing what he would need. "First," he said, "let's make some more adjustments to get him through the night. Then we can talk about building something better." As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the garage windows, Joe Cooper began the work that would change not only Tommy's life, but his own as well. His father's journal lay open beside him, its pages seeming to whisper, "Every machine tells a story. You just have to listen." The modified pressure gauge on Tommy's respirator caught the morning light, its new brass fittings standing out against the weathered plastic of the original device. Joe had worked through the night, making careful adjustments while Sarah dozed, fitfully on the office couch, one hand always reaching toward her son. "See this reading here?" Joe spoke softly to Tommy, who watched with bright interest as Joe calibrated the gauge. "When the needle stays in the green zone, that means you're getting exactly the right amount of air, just like timing the fuel mixture in a high-performance engine." Tommy's small hand reached out to touch the gauge, and Joe noticed his fingernails had more color than the previous evening. "A good sign." "You can touch it," Joe encouraged, guiding Tommy's finger to the glass face of the gauge. "Feel how smooth it turns. That's because we replaced the worn-out bearings. Old ones were grinding like my cousin Eddie's transmission after. He tried fixing it himself." Tommy smiled at that, the first real smile Joe had seen from him. Sarah stirred on the couch, immediately alert. "How is he?" she asked, moving to Tommy's side. "Oxygen saturation is up 8%, Joe reported, showing her the readings he'd been tracking in a worn notebook. "The new pressure regulation system is holding steady, and his breathing effort has decreased by almost 30%. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched Tommy's chest rise and fall with noticeably less strain. "How did you know what to do?" Joe picked up a complex-looking piece of equipment from his workbench. a custom pressure regulator he'd fabricated from spare parts. My father designed something similar for ventilators back in '85. The principle is the same. It's all about maintaining consistent pressure while adapting to the patient's breathing pattern. He demonstrated how the device worked, explaining each component in simple terms. See, most medical equipment treats every patient the same, but people aren't machines. They need equipment that adapts to them. A knock at the door interrupted his explanation. Dr. Harrison stood there looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mrs. Miller, I've been reviewing Tommy's overnight monitoring data from the hospital records." He paused, glancing at the modified respirator. "The numbers are surprising." "They're better," Sarah said firmly. "He's better." The doctor moved closer, his professional curiosity overtaking his skepticism as he examined Joe's modifications. "This pressure regulation system, it's not like anything I've seen before." "Because it's custom-built for Tommy," Joe explained, showing him the calibration log. "Standard medical equipment is designed for the average patient, but Tommy's breathing patterns aren't average." Dr. Harrison frowned at the log, then at his own charts. "The oxygen saturation levels, they shouldn't be possible with his condition." "Maybe you were measuring the equipment's limitations, not Tommy's," Joe suggested quietly. The doctor's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Tommy started coughing. Joe moved quickly, making a minor adjustment to the airflow. The coughing eased almost immediately. "How did you know to do that?" Dr. Harrison demanded. "I listened," Joe said simply. "To the machine and to Tommy. When you work on engines long enough, you learn that every sound means something. Bodies aren't that different. They tell you what they need, if you pay attention." Sarah watched the exchange with growing hope. Even Dr. Harrison couldn't deny the improvement in Tommy's condition. The boy was sitting up straighter, his eyes brighter, engaged with his surroundings in a way he hadn't been in weeks. "I'm not saying I approve of this unorthodox approach," Dr. Harrison said finally, "but I can't ignore the results. Would you be willing to share your data with the hospital's respiratory therapy team?" Joe nodded. "On one condition. Tommy stays here where I can monitor and adjust the equipment as needed. No standard protocols, no one-size-fits-all treatments." The doctor hesitated, then nodded curtly. "I'll make the arrangements. But I want daily reports, and if there's any deterioration, there won't be," Sarah said with quiet confidence, watching as Tommy reached again for the pressure gauge, fascinated by its steady movement. After Dr. Harrison left, Joe returned to his workbench, spreading out his father's journal alongside his own notes. "This is just the beginning," he told Sarah. "With a few more modifications, we could improve his breathing even more. I have some ideas." He trailed off, sketching a design on a clean page. Sarah watched him work, seeing the same focused intensity she'd noticed in Tommy when he was building with his Legos. In the background, the respirator hummed steadily, its sound now smooth and reassuring. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said softly. Joe's hands stilled for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "but what matters is that it's working. Tommy's fighting, and now he has the right tools to help him win." Through the office window, the morning sun illuminated the garage, glinting off tools and spare parts that were slowly being transformed into something more than the sum of their parts, something that might just save a young boy's life. While searching through old boxes for spare parts, Joe's hand brushed against a yellowed newspaper clipping. The Millbrook Gazette's headline from 15 years ago stared back at him. "Local engineers' medical innovation could revolutionize infant care." His father's face smiled from the photo, standing proudly next to a prototype that never made it to production. "What's that?" Sarah asked, noticing how Joe's movements had stilled. He handed her the clipping without a word, watching as she read the article that had once represented all his family's hopes. Tommy was dozing nearby, his breathing steadier than it had been in months. "Robert Cooper's revolutionary respiratory device promises to reduce infant mortality rates in premature births," Sarah read aloud. Clinical trials scheduled for spring. What happened? Joe ran a hand through his greying hair. The accident happened 3 weeks before the trials were set to begin. Black ice on Miller's Curve, the same stretch of road that's claimed. 3 lives since. He moved to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop, opening it for the first time in years. Inside sat the prototype from the newspaper photo, carefully preserved but incomplete. Dad was driving home from a meeting with investors. Mum was with him. They were celebrating. The funding had finally come through. Joe's voice grew distant. The police said he saw the logging truck in time to turn away. Saved the other driver's life, but Sarah laid a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Joe." He nodded, touching the prototype with careful fingers. "I was halfway through engineering school. Thought I'd join him in the business after graduation. Instead, I spent the next 6 months dealing with lawyers, insurance companies, and creditors. By the time the dust settled, the patents had expired, the investors had moved on, and this," he gestured to the prototype, "this became just another piece of unfinished business." "But you kept it," Sarah observed. "All these years. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Dad used to say every problem has a solution. You just have to be patient enough to find it." Joe smiled faintly. He'd work on this thing at night, after spending all day at his regular engineering job. Said if it saved even one child, it would be worth all the late nights. He pulled out his father's notebook, turning to a page filled with calculations. The design was sound. Dad had solved problems that the big medical companies are still struggling with today. But without him to champion it, to explain his vision, he shrugged. Sometimes being right isn't enough. You need the right people, the right moment. Sarah looked at Tommy, then back at the prototype. "Maybe this is the right moment." "What do you mean?" "These modifications you're making to Tommy's respirator, they're based on your father's principles, aren't they? His understanding of pressure regulation and airflow." Joe nodded slowly. "The basic concepts, yes, but adapted for a different purpose," Sarah finished. "Just like you've adapted yourself. You're not just a mechanic, Joe. You're your father's son, carrying on his work in your own way." The distant sound of a car pulling into the garage interrupted them. Joe quickly closed the cabinet, but not before taking one last look at the prototype. For the first time in years, its presence felt less like a reminder of failure and more like a foundation to build upon. Mike from the hardware store appeared in the doorway, holding another paper bag. "Martha sent dinner," he announced, then noticed the serious atmosphere. "Everything okay?" "Getting there," Joe said, managing a small smile. "Mike, I'm going to need some supplies, special orders, probably expensive ones." Mike waved away his concern. "Already talked to Martha about extending you credit. The whole town's talking about what you're doing for Tommy. Whatever you need, just say the word." As Mike left, Sarah studied the old newspaper photo again. "Your father looks so proud in this picture." "He was," Joe said softly. "Not of the invention, though that was important to him. He was proud because he believed he'd found a way to help people, to make a difference." He looked at Tommy's sleeping form. Maybe he still can. Moving to his workbench, Joe began sketching new modifications for Tommy's respirator, incorporating elements from his father's original design. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps it could still light the way forward. "Dad always said everything happens for a reason," Joe mused, making careful notes. "Took me 15 years to start believing him again." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows, illuminating father and son's work side by side. One project finished, another just beginning. In his sleep, Tommy took a deep, easy breath, the sound carrying hope for both the future and the past. Joe's hand-drawn respirator designs covered his workbench, each sketch more refined than the last. 3 days of constant tinkering had produced something entirely new, a hybrid device that merged his father's innovations with modern components. Tommy sat nearby in a makeshift recovery area, his breathing noticeably stronger as he worked on a model car kit Joe had given him. "Hold still for a moment, buddy," Joe said, adjusting the latest modification, a custom pressure distribution system that adapted to Tommy's breathing patterns. Let me check these readings. Sarah watched from her usual spot on the couch, grading papers between frequent glances at her son. The improvement in Tommy's condition had allowed her to return to teaching part-time, though she spent every free moment at the garage. "Look at this!" Joe called her over, pointing to the digital display he'd salvaged from an old diagnostic computer. "His oxygen saturation is approaching normal levels." Sarah leaned in, studying the numbers. Is that possible? With a standard respirator? No. Joe's eyes shone with quiet pride. But this isn't standard anymore. Here, let me show you what we've done. He spread out his latest design drawings, walking her through the modifications. See, traditional respirators force a set rhythm of breathing, but bodies don't work that way. Especially not bodies fighting to heal. We needed something that could learn from Tommy, adapt to his needs moment by moment. The design showed an intricate network of sensors and regulators, each piece carefully calibrated to work in harmony. Notes in Joe's precise handwriting filled the margins, documenting every adjustment and its effect on Tommy's breathing. "It's like a partnership," Joe explained, watching Tommy work on his model car. "The machine supports him, but it also listens to what his body is telling it he needs. When he needs more air, it responds. When he needs less, it backs off. No fighting against a pre-programmed pattern." A familiar voice interrupted from the doorway. "Those numbers can't be right." Dr. Harrison stood there, holding his own medical charts. The past few days had seen him making increasingly frequent visits, his skepticism gradually giving way to reluctant fascination. "Check them yourself," Joe offered, stepping aside from the monitoring equipment. "Run whatever tests you want." The doctor moved forward, his professional detachment slipping as he examined the readouts. "This is remarkable, the improvement in his lung function." He turned to Sarah. "Has he been sleeping better?" "Through the night," she confirmed. "No more episodes. He even asked to go back to school next week." "School?" Dr. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "A week ago, we were discussing hospice care, and now he wants to return to school?" Tommy looked up from his model car. "I'm building this for show and tell," he said, his voice stronger than any of them had heard in months. "Joe's teaching me about engines." The doctor shook his head in amazement, then focused on the design drawings. "These modifications, they're unlike anything in current medical literature. The way you've approached the pressure regulation alone could revolutionize respiratory therapy." "It's not revolutionary," Joe said quietly. "It's just listening to what the patient needs. My father understood that 15 years ago." Dr. Harrison was already pulling out his phone. "The head of respiratory medicine at State University has been asking about your work. These results, they need to be documented, studied. This could help thousands of patients." Joe's hand moved protectively over his father's journal. "On one condition, everything we develop stays open source. No patents, no corporate lockdown of the technology. My father's work was meant to help people, not make profits. But the potential commercial applications aren't why we're doing this," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Look at my son, doctor. Really look at him. He's getting better because Joe saw him as a person, not a collection of symptoms or a business opportunity." The doctor fell silent, watching as Tommy showed Joe a particularly tricky piece of his model car. The boy's breathing was steady, his color healthy, his movements energetic. It was impossible to reconcile this child with the terminal patient he'd been just days ago. "I'll make some calls," he said finally. "There are research grants, medical innovation funds, ways to develop this properly while keeping it accessible." Joe nodded, already turning back to his workbench. "First, we finished Tommy's treatment. Everything else can wait." But as the doctor left, Joe allowed himself a small smile. His father's journal lay open beside the new designs, past and present working together to forge a future neither of them had imagined. Tommy's voice broke into his thoughts. "Joe, can you help me with this part?" "Sure, buddy." Joe pulled up, a chair beside him. You know, my dad taught me to build models just like this, said understanding how small things work together helps you build bigger things, like my breathing machine. Exactly like that. Joe helped Tommy align a tiny engine part. Everything's connected, see? Just like your breath is connected to the machine and the machine is connected to you. It's all about finding the right balance. Sarah watched them work together, tears pricking at her eyes. Through the garage windows, she could see curious faces peering in. Word had spread about the miracle happening at Cooper's Auto Repair, but here in this moment, it wasn't about miracles or medical breakthroughs. It was about two people building something together, while a boy's steady breathing kept time like a well-tuned engine. The letter from the hospital ethics committee lay open on Joe's workbench, its official letterhead and formal language casting a shadow over the morning's progress. Cease and desist. Unauthorized medical treatment. Potential legal consequences. The words seemed to mock the steady rhythm of Tommy's improved breathing. They can't do this, Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. They can't just shut you down when it's working. Joe read the letter again, his expression carefully neutral. They can, and from their perspective, they should. I'm not licensed. This isn't an approved medical facility. But Dr. Harrison has been monitoring everything. He's seen the results, which is why he's fighting for us at the board meeting right now, Joe interrupted gently. But it doesn't change the fact that they're right. I'm a mechanic working out of a garage. The door chime interrupted them. Nancy, the nurse who had first sent Sarah to Joe, hurried in. They're still deliberating, she reported, slightly out of breath. Dr. Harrison is showing them all the data, but some of the board members are worried about liability. Tommy looked up from his model car, worry creasing his young forehead. Do I have to go back to the old machine? Joe moved to his side, checking the current readings. Not if I can help it, buddy. Sometimes people just need time to understand new ideas. The respirator hummed steadily, its custom modifications a testament to what was possible when convention gave way to innovation. But Joe knew the battle ahead wasn't about technology. It was about systems and rules that didn't know how to bend, even when bending might save lives. Sarah clutched the letter, her teacher's instinct for fairness warring with a mother's. Fierce protection. If they force us to stop, he'll get worse again. You know he will. Joe's response was interrupted by his office phone. The conversation was brief, but his face told the story before he hung up. The committee wants to see the device, he said, and all my documentation. Tomorrow morning. Sarah straightened. Then we'll show them. We'll prove it works. Joe looked round his workshop, at the hybrid of automotive tools and medical innovation, at Tommy breathing easily while building his model, at his father's journal full of dreams that were finally finding their way into reality. Yes, he said quietly, we will. Mike Preston stood at Joe's workbench, adding his signature to the growing list of petition signatures that had begun circulating through town. The hardware store owner's usually jovial face was set with determination as he wrote, Martha's got the ladies' auxiliary making calls, he reported. Pastor Roberts signed first thing this morning. Even old man Jenkins rolled his wheelchair down here to sign, said he remembers when your father saved his wife with that custom heart monitor back in '82. The petition had started organically, born from the town's coffee shop conversations and grocery store encounters. Now it represented something larger, a community's belief in one of their own. The thing is, Mike continued, folks around here remember your father. They remember how many lives he touched with his unofficial medical work. That kind of memory runs deep in a small town. Sarah watched as another group of townspeople entered the garage, each waiting patiently to add their names to the petition. Among them was her principal, 3 of Tommy's former teachers, and the elderly pharmacist who had been filling Tommy's prescriptions since birth. Joe, the pharmacist called out, making his way forward. I brought something you should see. He pulled out a faded prescription pad. Your father used to draw his device modifications on these. Helped me understand how to adjust medication delivery systems for special cases. Still use his methods today. Tommy sat with his improved respirator, watching the steady stream of visitors with wide eyes. "Did you know all these people, Joe?" "Some of them," Joe answered softly. "But they all knew my father, or what he stood for." Nancy arrived with a fresh stack of signatures from the hospital staff. "Half the nursing department signed," she announced, "and 3 respiratory specialists want to observe your methods. They're saying this could change everything about how we approach adaptive breathing support." The afternoon brought more supporters, farmers who remembered Robert Cooper fixing their equipment during hard times, teachers who had watched Tommy's struggle from the beginning, mechanics who had learned their trade under Joe's guidance. Each signature carried a story, a connection, a reason why this mattered beyond just one boy's treatment. The petition was becoming more than a list of names. It was becoming a testament to the power of community trust over institutional doubt. Mayor Thompson arrived later that afternoon, his presence adding official weight to the grassroots movement. "Cooper," he said, gripping Joe's hand firmly. "My father always said your dad was ahead of his time. Looks like being ahead of the curve. Runs in the family." The mayor studied Tommy's modified respirator with genuine interest. "You know, we've been trying to attract medical technology companies to the industrial park. Maybe what we needed was right here all along." Local business owners began offering their support in practical ways. The diner started sending over free meals. The print shop produced professional copies of Joe's technical documentation. The construction company offered to help modify the garage to meet basic medical facility standards. As the sun began to set, Sarah watched the continued stream of visitors with tears in her eyes. "I never knew," she whispered to Joe. "I never knew how many lives your family had touched." Joe nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. His father's journal lay open on the workbench, its pages a blueprint not just for medical innovations, but for the kind of impact one person could have on a community. "Sometimes," Mike said, watching the crowd, "doing right matters more than doing things by the book. And sometimes," he added with a knowing smile, "it takes a whole town to prove it." The petition pages filled with signatures represented more than support. They were a community's declaration that innovation and care shouldn't be limited by credentials alone. Each name was a vote of confidence in the power of practical knowledge, guided by compassion. As the day wound down, Tommy's improved breathing served as a constant reminder of what was at stake. The boy had become more than a patient. He was now a symbol of what could be achieved when a community chose hope over convention, trust over bureaucracy. "Your father would be proud," Sarah told Joe quietly, "not just of the device, but of how you've brought people together." Joe looked at the pages of signatures, at Tommy working on his model car, at the faces of neighbors who had become advocates. Tomorrow, they would face the hospital board, but they wouldn't face it alone. Sometimes, the strongest medical validation came not from clinical trials, but from the collective memory of lives made better by someone who dared to think differently. The independent medical review team moved through Joe's workshop with methodical precision, their white coats stark against the garage's industrial backdrop. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead investigator, studied the modified respirator with intense focus, her expert eyes taking in every detail of Joe's innovations. "The pressure response calibration is remarkable," she murmured, making detailed notes. "And this adaptive flow regulation, I've never seen anything quite like it." She turned to Joe. "You developed this entirely from mechanical engineering principles." "My father's principles," Joe corrected, handing her his careful documentation. "I just adapted them for Tommy's specific needs." Dr. Rodriguez reviewed the technical data, her eyebrows rising. "These oxygen saturation levels, they're far beyond what we typically see with standard equipment, and the long-term stability of the readings is unprecedented for a case this severe." The team's respiratory specialist, Dr. Chen, was examining Joe's design drawings. The way you've integrated mechanical feedback loops with biological responses, it's essentially a dialogue between patient and machine. We've been theorizing about this approach at the research level, but nobody's implemented it successfully until now. Tommy sat quietly through the examination process, answering the doctor's questions with growing confidence. His breathing remained strong and steady, each clear inhale a testament to Joe's work. "Can you explain how you arrived at these specific calibrations?" Dr. Chen asked, pointing to a particularly complex set of calculations in Joe's notes. Joe pulled out his father's journal, turning to a well-worn page. "It started with my father's observations about pressure variability in medical equipment. He noticed that machines were designed for optimal performance under standardized conditions. But human bodies aren't standardized. They're dynamic, constantly adjusting. He showed them the series of modifications he'd made, each one fine-tuned to Tommy's breathing patterns. Instead of forcing Tommy to adapt to the machine, we made the machine adapt to him. Every adjustment is based on real-time feedback from his breathing patterns." Dr. Rodriguez's team conducted thorough tests, measuring and documenting every aspect of the modified respirator's performance. Their initial skepticism gave way to professional curiosity, then to barely concealed excitement as the data confirmed what they were seeing. "The implications for respiratory therapy are significant," Dr. Rodriguez said, reviewing the final test results. "This could completely change our approach to long-term respiratory support. The ability to create truly adaptive medical devices." She shook her head in amazement. "Mr. Cooper, would you be willing to collaborate with our research team?" "As long as the technology remains accessible," Joe stipulated. "No patents, no exclusive licenses. That was my father's way. Helping people was always more important than profit." The validation in the independent medical review had come at a crucial time. Tomorrow, they would face the hospital board with solid scientific evidence backing their unorthodox approach. The data spoke for itself. Tommy's improvement wasn't just anecdotal. It was measurable, significant, and reproducible. "We'll prepare our report immediately," Dr. Rodriguez announced. "The board needs to understand what's been achieved here. This isn't just about one case. It's about the potential to help countless patients." As the medical team packed up their equipment, Dr. Chen paused by Tommy's bedside. "How do you feel about being part of medical history, young man?" Tommy grinned, his healthy color and clear eyes a far cry from the pale, struggling boy who had first entered Joe's garage. "I just like being able to breathe," he said simply, "and building model cars with Joe." Sometimes the most powerful innovations came not from high-tech laboratories, but from places where necessity and ingenuity met, like a small-town garage, where a mechanic dared to think differently about how to help a young boy breathe. Sarah spread the business plan across Joe's workbench, her hands smoothing the crisp pages that represented weeks of research and planning. The draft outlined a vision that seemed almost too perfect, transforming Cooper's auto repair into a specialized medical device innovation center. "I've been talking with the bank," she explained, pointing to the financial projections. "Between my savings, the house equity, and the preliminary interest from medical suppliers, we could do this. Really do this." Joe studied the detailed drawings of the proposed facility. His father's old workspace would become a development lab, while the main garage area would be converted into a testing and calibration center. It was everything his father had dreamed of, presented in practical, achievable steps. "Sarah, this is your family's security we're talking about," he said quietly. "I can't ask you to risk that." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." She turned to where Tommy was doing his homework, breathing easily with his modified respirator. "Look at him, Joe. How many other families could you help if you had the right resources?" The business plan included letters of interest from medical equipment manufacturers, preliminary approval from local zoning boards, and even a note from Mayor Thompson about potential municipal support. It was thorough, practical, and terrifying in its potential. Your father's work doesn't have to end here, Sarah said softly. This could be his legacy, and yours. Joe walked the perimeter of his workshop, touching the tools that had been his life for so many years. Each wrench, each diagnostic device, told a story of cars fixed and problems solved. But now they seemed to whisper of greater possibilities. The initial investment would be substantial, he mused, returning to the financial section. Even with the bank's support. Look at page 12, Sarah urged. Dr. Rodriguez's team has already expressed interest in establishing a research partnership. Their funding could cover nearly half the startup costs. The numbers were compelling, but it was more than that. The plan detailed how they could help other families, other children struggling with respiratory issues. It outlined a vision of medical innovation that put people first, just as his father had always intended. We'd need to maintain the auto repair business during the transition, Joe said, his practical side emerging. Some of these loyal customers have been with my family for generations. Sarah nodded, flipping to another section of the plan. That's all accounted for. We can phase the conversion over 18 months, keeping part of the garage operational while we build out the medical facility. Mike Preston chose that moment to walk in, carrying his usual delivery of Martha's cooking. He took in the scene. The business plan, Sarah's eager expression, Joe's thoughtful consideration. About time, Mike said, setting down the food. Robert always said this place would be more than just a garage someday. Martha and I want in. We've got some savings we'd like to invest. Joe looked at him in surprise. Mike, you can't... I can't what? Invest in the future of our town, in something that could help people like Tommy, Mike grinned. Besides, Martha would never forgive me if I didn't help Robert Cooper's boy fulfill his daddy's dream. The afternoon light slanted through the garage windows, illuminating the business plan that represented so much more than a simple change of direction. It was a bridge between past and future, between what was and what could be. Tommy looked up from his homework. Does this mean you'll be helping other kids breathe better, Joe? If we do this right, buddy, Joe answered, his decision crystallizing in that moment. A lot of other kids. Sarah watched understanding dawn in Joe's eyes. Sometimes the biggest dreams started with the smallest moments. A desperate mother entering a garage, a mechanic willing to think differently, and a boy who just wanted to breathe. The emergency response log would later show it started at 2:47 a.m. Sarah's frantic call jolted Joe from his office cot, where he'd fallen asleep working on design improvements. Tommy's breathing had suddenly become labored, the modified respirator's alarms breaking the night's quiet. Something's wrong. Sarah's voice shook through the phone. The readings are all off. We're coming in. Joe was already moving, pulling out his diagnostic equipment and emergency backup systems. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from countless nights spent preparing for this possibility. The emergency protocols he'd developed were spread across his workbench, contingency plans he'd hoped never to need. They arrived in a screech of tires, Sarah practically carrying Tommy despite his size. The boy's lips had a bluish tinge that made Joe's heart skip. Dr. Harrison, summoned by Sarah's second call, arrived moments later, medical bag in hand and all previous professional distance forgotten in the urgency of the moment. Pressure's dropping, Joe reported, eyes fixed on the readings. The primary valve assembly is failing. His fingers flew over the equipment, making rapid adjustments. Tommy, buddy, I need you to take slow breaths for me, just like we practiced. Dr. Harrison moved in with his stethoscope, his earlier skepticism, transformed into focused determination. Bilateral wheezing, decreased breath sounds on the left. He looked at Joe. What do you need? The backup system's ready, but the transition has to be perfect. Joe's voice was steady, despite the fear clutching at his chest. I need your help monitoring his vitals while I make the switch. We can't afford any gaps in his oxygen flow. Sarah held Tommy's hand as the two men worked in synchronized precision. Joe's mechanical expertise guided the equipment transition, while Dr. Harrison's medical knowledge tracked Tommy's responses. Years of different types of experience merged in the common goal of helping a child breathe. Oxygen saturation dropping, Dr. Harrison warned. We need to move now. Joe's hands were already in motion, connecting the backup system. Tommy, this might feel different for a moment. Remember what we talked about? Like switching gears in a car. There's always that little pause, but then everything runs smooth again. Now, Joe said, initiating the switch. For 3 terrifying seconds, Tommy's breath hitched. The boy's eyes went wide with panic, his grip on Sarah's hand turning white-knuckled. Then the backup system engaged, its rhythmic hum filling the tense. Silence. Pressure stabilizing, Dr. Harrison reported, relief evident in his voice. Breath sounds improving. He continued his examination, each positive finding releasing another fraction of the room's tension. Color returning to normal. You did it, Joe. Tommy's breathing gradually eased, his death grip on Sarah's hand relaxing. Joe continued making minute adjustments, each tweak bringing the readings closer to optimal levels. The crisis wasn't fully over. He could see irregularities in the backup system's performance that would need addressing, but the immediate danger had passed. Later, as Tommy slept peacefully on the office couch, Joe and Dr. Harrison examined the failed component together. The doctor's medical perspective, combined with Joe's mechanical insight, revealed the problem, and a solution neither might have. Seen alone, the stress fatigue in the valve assembly, Joe explained, sketching a new design. It's similar to what happens in high-performance engines under sustained pressure. And the physiological response, Dr. Harrison added, mirrors what we see in patients during respiratory distress. The body and the machine both adapting to extreme conditions. We need both approaches, the doctor admitted, watching Joe refine the sketch. The medicine and the mechanics. I've been too quick to dismiss what I didn't understand. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your father, he saw this connection long ago, didn't he? Joe nodded, thinking of the journals, filled with observations that bridged the gap between mechanical engineering and medical science. He always said machines were just artificial organisms. Understand one, and you're halfway to understanding the other. Sarah, who hadn't left Tommy's side, looked up at them. So what happens now? Now, Joe said, determination hardening his voice. We make sure this never happens again. We build something better. He turned to Dr. Harrison. But I'll need your help, both your medical knowledge and your standing with the hospital board. The doctor extended his hand. Partners, then. The night's crisis had forged something unexpected, a collaboration that bridged the gap between traditional medicine and innovative engineering. The emergency response log would record the technical details, but not the more important breakthrough, the moment when professional barriers fell before the simple need to help a child breathe. The medical journal submission lay open on Joe's workbench, its precise academic language describing his innovations in respiratory therapy. Dr. Harrison had helped translate Joe's practical engineering knowledge into the formal terminology required for publication, but the core insights remained pure Cooper innovation. Novel approach to adaptive respiratory support, integration of mechanical engineering principles in patient-responsive treatment, Dr. Harrison read aloud. Lead authors, Joseph Cooper and James Harrison, M.D. Joe ran his fingers over the title page. My father's name should be there too. It is, Dr. Harrison pointed to the acknowledgements, and his original patents are cited throughout. This paper doesn't just validate your work, Joe. It establishes a historical foundation for adaptive medical device design. The submission included detailed case studies, not just Tommy's, but 5 other patients who had benefited from Joe's modifications to their respiratory equipment. Each success had strengthened their case, building a compelling argument for this new approach to medical device design. The peer review committee meets next week, Dr. Harrison continued. But I've already heard from colleagues at 3 major research hospitals. They want to start clinical trials as soon as possible. Sarah entered the garage, carrying fresh coffee. "The hospital board called," she announced. "They're talking about establishing a dedicated research facility right here in town." Dr. Rodriguez had arrived early that morning to review the final draft. Her expertise in respiratory medicine had helped shape the paper's technical sections, adding weight to their findings. "The data is impressive," she'd said. "But what's more impressive is how you've managed to bridge the gap between theoretical medicine and practical application." The paper detailed not just the technical innovations, but the philosophy behind them. The idea that medical devices should adapt to patients rather than forcing patients to adapt to them. It was a paradigm shift that challenged decades of standardized medical equipment design. "Look at this section," Dr. Harrison said, turning to a particular page. "The way you've documented the relationship between mechanical stress patterns and biological response. It's revolutionary. Engineers have been studying stress fatigue in machinery for years, but nobody thought to apply those principles to medical equipment adaptation." Joe thought of his father's old journals, filled with similar observations that had gone unrecognized. Now, finally, these ideas would reach the wider medical community. The paper included extensive technical drawings, pressure response curves, and patient outcome data, all supporting the effectiveness of the Cooper approach. Tommy, working on his latest model car nearby, looked up. "Does this mean other kids will get to breathe better too?" "That's exactly what it means, buddy," Joe answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your courage helped make this possible." "Dr. Rodriguez sent this over," Sarah added, handing Joe another document. "The National Respiratory Therapy Conference wants you to be their keynote speaker." The invitation represented more than just professional recognition. It was an opportunity to share these innovations with the broader medical community. The conference organizers had specifically requested that Joe demonstrate the practical applications of his approach, showing other medical professionals how to bridge the gap between engineering principles and patient care. "They want you to do a hands-on workshop too," Sarah continued, "teaching doctors and medical engineers how to implement your modifications." Joe looked around his workshop, where car parts and medical innovations now shared space in an unlikely harmony. The journal submission represented more than just academic recognition. It was validation of his father's vision, proof that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected places. "Your father would be proud," Dr. Harrison said quietly, "not just of the innovation, but of how you've brought people together. Medicine needs more of this. More collaboration, more thinking outside traditional boundaries." The final paragraph of the submission summed it up perfectly. "This work demonstrates the vital importance of cross-disciplinary approaches in medical innovation. When we break down the barriers between mechanical engineering and medical science, we open new possibilities for patient care." Sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come not from traditional research facilities, but from places where practical experience meets urgent need. As if to punctuate that thought, Tommy's respirator hummed quietly in the background, its sound now familiar and reassuring, a testament to what could be achieved when people dared to think differently about solving problems. The stack of old letters emerged from a dusty box in Joe's father's workshop, preserved in their original envelopes. Each bore the letterhead of various medical institutions, dating back to the early days of Robert Cooper's career. Joe sat at his workbench, carefully unfolding the first one as Sarah watched. "Dear Mr. Cooper," Joe read aloud, "while your design shows promise, we regret to inform you that without formal medical credentials," he picked up another, "innovative approach, but our institution requires traditional medical certification." And another, "Unfortunately, our funding guidelines specify." They all said no. Sarah moved closer, examining a letter dated just months before the accident. "Look at this one. It's different." The letter was from Dr. William Chen, father of the same Dr. Chen who had recently validated Joe's work. "Robert," Joe read, his voice softening. I've reviewed your designs, and they're extraordinary. The way you've integrated mechanical principles with medical needs could revolutionize patient care. I'm pushing the board to reconsider their position. He believed in your father's work, Sarah said quietly. Too late. Joe touched the letter's date. The accident happened 2 weeks after this was written. As they continued through the correspondence, a clearer picture of Robert Cooper emerged. Each rejection letter was accompanied by his draft responses, showing how he refined his arguments, improved his designs, found new ways to explain his vision. The man in these letters wasn't defeated by setbacks, he was energized by them. Look at how he adapted this design. Joe pointed to a series of sketches attached to the letters. Each rejection made him think deeper, push further. He wasn't just an engineer trying to break into medicine. He was bridging two worlds that desperately needed to connect. One letter particularly caught Sarah's attention. It was from a mother whose child had benefited from one of Robert's unofficial modifications to her medical equipment. Your help saved my daughter's life, Sarah read, tears in her eyes. I don't care what the medical board says. You're a healer. Dad never showed me these, Joe said softly. Never talked about the lives he touched. He just kept working, kept trying to make things better. Tommy had wandered over, curious, about their discovery. Your dad was like you, Joe, he said, picking up one of the technical drawings. He fixed things to help people. Joe smiled, remembering long nights in the workshop, watching his father work. He used to say that every machine had a story to tell, that if you listened carefully enough, you could hear what it needed to work better. The letters weren't just a record of rejection. They were a roadmap showing how determination and ingenuity could overcome institutional barriers. Robert Cooper had laid the groundwork for what his son would eventually achieve, proving that sometimes the most important innovations come from outside traditional channels. Your father would be proud, Sarah said, but this time Joe didn't just nod politely. He knew, Joe replied, holding up one final letter he'd found at the bottom of the box. It was unfinished, never sent, addressed to him. Son, he read, his voice thick with emotion, remember that helping people is worth every setback. The world may not be ready for new ideas, but keep pushing forward. Sometimes the best mechanics are the ones who can fix more than just engines. The Goutier workshop renovation plans spread across Joe's desk told a story of transformation. Detailed blueprints showed how Cooper's auto repair would evolve into the Cooper Medical Innovation Center, merging his father's vision with modern medical technology. The old garage bays would become testing areas, the tool room a precision calibration lab, and his father's old workspace a research and development center. Sign here, Sarah said softly, sliding the partnership agreement forward. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Rodriguez stood nearby, their presence lending weight to the moment. The document represented more than just a business arrangement. It was a commitment to a new future. Joe picked up the pen, then hesitated. What about the regular customers? Some of these folks have been coming here since my father's time. Mike Preston spoke up from where he'd been examining the blueprints. Already thought of that. Jenkins's boy is opening a new garage on Maple. He's agreed to take on your customer files, and he wants to apprentice here, learn about medical equipment repair. The best of both worlds, Dr. Harrison added. We keep the mechanical expertise in town while building something new. Your father understood that good engineering principles apply everywhere. Now we can prove it. Tommy sat in his usual spot, breathing easily with his improved respirator, absorbed in his latest model car project. The sight of him, healthy, active, alive, was all the confirmation Joe needed. The boy who had once struggled for every breath was now planning to join the school science fair, inspired by the machinery that had given him back his life. The renovation plans included a special area dedicated to teaching, a place where doctors and engineers could learn to work together, breaking down the artificial barriers between their fields. It would be called the Robert Cooper Innovation Lab, ensuring his father's name would be associated with the breakthrough he had long envisioned. "The funding is secure," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed, noting Joe's glance at the budget section. "Between the research grants, private investment, and the hospital's commitment, we can begin immediately. Your father's patents, updated with your recent innovations, will ensure the technology remains accessible to those who need it." The pen moved across the paper, each signature marking another step toward fulfilling his father's legacy. The renovations would begin next week, but the real transformation had started months ago, with a desperate mother and a boy who just wanted to breathe. Dr. Rodriguez smiled as she collected the signed documents. "Welcome to the future of medical innovation, Mr. Cooper. Or should I say Dr. Cooper? The university board approved your honorary doctorate this morning. They felt it was time to formally recognize that brilliant solutions can come from unexpected places." Joe looked around his workshop one last time, at the tools that had built his life, at the people who had helped him build a new dream, and at Tommy, living proof that sometimes the best mechanics are the ones who can fix more than just engines. The first patent application for the Cooper-Harrison adaptive respiratory system lay on Joe's new desk, its pages filled with detailed technical drawings and specifications. The familiar garage smell of oil and metal now mingled with the clean scent of fresh paint and new equipment as the transformation of the space continued around them. "Just got word from the review board," Dr. Harrison announced, entering the partially renovated office. "They've fast-tracked the application. Your father's original patents helped establish precedent. They're calling this a continuation of pioneering work in the field." Joe nodded, touching the embossed letterhead that now read Cooper Medical Innovation Center. The patent wasn't just for Tommy's respirator design. It covered the entire adaptive approach to medical device modification, ensuring that others could build upon their work. "3 more families contacted us this morning," Sarah added, reviewing her tablet. "Word spreading faster than we expected." She smiled at Tommy, who was helping organize the new research library. "Your story's giving people hope." Through the window, Joe could see the construction crews expanding the building, adding the new wings that would house their research and development facilities. But more importantly, they were building something his father had always dreamed of, the place where practical innovation could directly help people in need. Dr. Rodriguez joined them, carrying the latest batch of testing results. "The university team is amazed by the adaptability of the system," she reported. "They're already talking about applying similar principles to other medical devices." The patent application would be the first of many, each one open source, each one carrying forward the Cooper legacy of putting people before profit. In the corner, Tommy's original respirator sat in a display case, a reminder of where it all started, and proof that sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from simply trying to help one person breathe. Mike Preston poked his head, grinning at the sight of the bustling activity. "Martha wants to know if you're all still coming to dinner Sunday. Says you can't save the world on an empty stomach." Joe smiled, realizing that in all the changes, some things would stay wonderfully the same. The small town that had supported his father, then him, would continue to be the foundation upon which they built this new dream. 1 year later, the photograph, taken at the Cooper Medical Innovation Center's official opening, captured a moment that seemed both an ending and a beginning. Tommy stood front and center, his breathing strong and steady, flanked by Sarah, Joe, and Dr. Harrison. Behind them, the transformed facility gleamed in the morning sun, its doors open to welcome the first wave of patients seeking help. The sign above the entrance honored both past and present, Cooper Medical Innovation Center, where engineering meets medicine. Inside, Joe's father's original workshop had been preserved, integrated into the modern facility as a reminder of where it all began. Tommy's science fair project about adaptive medical equipment had won first place. Dr. Harrison now led seminars where doctors and engineers worked together. and Sarah had established a foundation ensuring that families in need would always have access to the center's innovations. Joe stood in his new office, holding his father's old wrench alongside his honorary doctorate. Sometimes the most important fixes started with simply being willing to try something different.